I'm sure a lot of you have been hearing about AI this week. I've had more than one conversation about it.
This is the different conversation about it, though.
This is a slight twist on it, which is something I haven't heard a lot of, which is that, that we've talked a lot about AI automating tasks that nobody wants to do, but I think we all get a sense that there's going to be some real implications for the C-suite, for CEOs, and that this is a technology that is going to need to be understood and managed at the highest of levels. And we're fortunate to have a panel of C-suite executives who are not only working out these problems for themselves, but also advising partners and clients and offering solutions. So we have a couple of different perspectives there. We've got Matt McDonald, the president of Penta, Valerie Bousseau-James, who is the Chief Sales and Marketing Officer at Adecco Group, and then Ravin Gunasathan.
Close.
Oh. And Andy told me right before I walked on stage, and he said, "Don't screw it up." Who is the partner at Mercer and a best-selling author, and really one of the foremost thinkers about first digital transformation, and now this latest incarnation that's being infused with AI. I thought maybe we would start with a rather radical proposition, which is that the WEF came out and said there's going to be 85 million jobs that will be displaced because of AI and AI technologies, and then optimistically said there'll be 97 new jobs that are created so that we can feel good about the overall net value. But my question is, how many of those jobs are going to be in the C-suite? And why? Is that something C-suite executives should be thinking about?
The impact is going to be felt certainly lower down in the organization. I really worry about these headline narratives about all these jobs being destroyed and all these jobs being created, because as we all know, the impact is incredibly more nuanced, and the impact is much, much harder to embed in organizations. So I started writing about the future of work back in 2007, and the impact of AI back in 2012, when I published a book with the Harvard Business Review. And the thing that we showed in about 130 case studies is that the business leaders who led with the work consistently got to much higher order outcomes than the ones who led with the tech. And we're seeing that play out with Gen AI. Because the ones who lead with the work actually saw the nuances of where some activity might be substituted, a lot more activity augmented, as we're seeing with Gen AI particularly, but more importantly, where the work itself and the workforce and the skills were fundamentally being transformed, because now you had space for new types of work to be taken on and the demand for a whole new set of skills. And that's versus the ones who led with the tech ended up in a very binary narrative between the person doing the job today and that machine that was supposed to replace him or her. And so that's why I worry about the forum's narrative about that. I've been on their steering committee on work and employment since 2015, and I've tried mightily to change that narrative to be one about work rather than jobs, but clearly have not been successful. But I
blame journalists.
Yeah, there you go.
We're just suckers for those.
You need the headlines. But I do think, in terms of the role of the C-suite, I think it's one of the things we wrote about in our last book was how the expectations of leaders were just going through the roof, right? We used to demand digital fluency. That is no longer sufficient at all. We need real technological and AI fluency. We need leaders who can understand how to combine work across multiple platforms, across different talent engagement models, and to actually have work design as a core capability, because they're going to be asked to reinvent work consistently. So I don't know if we'll see a reduction in leaders. Certainly some leadership work is going to change, but I think the bar on leaders is just going to be raised exponentially.
Valerie, in the sales and marketing space, these are the executives I think are, in a lot of ways, the early adopters and the first movers. How have you seen the C-suite adapt?
Well, I think that's something that I'm sure everybody has heard is AI has been the fastest and the most grassroots adoption of any recent technology that we've observed. And so for me, that's already the signal that this is changing something in the role of the leader. Most of the technology adoption in the past has been driven top-down. Let's talk about it. Now I remember, I will give you my own case. When we started to talk a lot about AI last summer, I started to ask my team, okay, let's get a group together to think about what we can do with AI. And they came and say, "Where are you using it?" I was like, okay, so they already had like dozens of use cases to create content, to do ads, to do targeting. And so this grassroots adoption was very interesting for me to observe. And that I do believe, I absolutely agree with what you were saying, which is this vision of doom, all these roles that are going to be displaced. Actually, to your point, we see that it's going to be very much more nuanced. In the Adecco group, we put 2 million of people at work every day. We train hundreds of thousands of people every year. Just to give you a sense of, we operate across 65 countries, all industries, all profiles. So we see a lot of this conversation shaping up. What we believe is that the nature of the work is going to change. And probably there are some tasks within a job that's going to be taken over or augmented by AI. But will all these jobs be deprecated? I don't think so. Of course, as usual with any transformation, there will be change, but I don't think it will be totally disappearing. So to the role of the leader, not only you need to be very fluent in digital to understand what you can expect, because the other thing that I see, to build a bit on your point, is today it's very much incremental improvement. When I asked my team what they did, and the example that I gave you on sales and marketing, it was small incremental improvement. It was not, what are the big problems we need to solve as a company to be more effective in go-to-market that we would solve? And that would require a more holistic thoughts about AI. So this fluency is very important. And last point I want to make is about the role and the skills of a leader. And this has been talked about a lot. To your point about leaders who were leading from the work, or leaders who are leading from expertise. We know this is a shift that has started. This is going to be vastly accelerated with AI. Because the expertise, you know what, is going to be totally leveled up, because everybody will have access to that expertise at their fingertips. You're going to ask, well, already you have access to data, but it will be even easier to get access to data, even to have a prompt to understand the data. So the prerogative of the leader, who is the one who has the 360 view, understanding, because you are all in task mode, this is going away. So it means I need to reinvent my role as a leader, much more anchored on the usual, EQ, critical thinking, creativity, innovation. And we've just run a survey across 2,000 leaders around the world. They're all saying that these are the skills that are the most in deficit in the leadership skills today. So we can talk more, but I just wanted to post that as a starting point.
Yeah, this is one of the topics Matt and I were talking about earlier, which is that when when AI has democratized analysis and data access and all of these things that are inside the enterprise and inside your business, suddenly there's a whole new skill set that's required from a CEO or from a leader.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even we're seeing the same thing with some of our team already using AI and ways to leverage their time in content creation and that sort of thing. I think it's an interesting thought experiment to think about what it means to leverage time in the C-suite and what that implies. There's discussions around some of this of what's your AI replica, or if I wrote a book and AI read the book, what would Matt say about whatever? Mm-hmm. It implies something interesting about the C-suite in terms of what C-suite and the levels below it, a lot of management. You think about span of control questions and these types of things in like organizational design. Like what if instead of having 8 direct reports, you could have 50 direct reports? That could be transformative for organizations and how they're structured. I mean, we might be looking at a future with much flatter organizations where on balance, maybe there's more individual contributors, but like the organizing of stuff is from an analysis perspective, from a coaching perspective. We're using AI for some of those types of tools. So I think I agree. I think it's a very accessible tool and technology that everyone sees. You can say, how do I go skiing at Friday on Davos after everybody leaves? And it'll give you an answer, right? But that accessibility sometimes can obscure the possibilities of like reinvention. I think a lot of people are like using it in like a very concrete way right away, but I think the potential for more profound change over the 3-year, 5-year horizon could be significant.
I think that's part of, I mean, what happened in most workplaces happened in ours, certainly. As soon as the tools became available, people started using them. And then they were shouting out, guess what I just figured out how to do?
Right.
Because they're making their lives easier. And that's great from the bottom up. But it does put pressure on the leaders to be like, well, I don't know if that's the best way to do this. I don't know if I want you to do it this way. And we were talking that setting that vision and having those soft skills of like, this is what's important to the organization. You're just getting work done faster, but it may not be the most important work.
Yeah, I think it points to the EQ question, and as decision making or analysis, the things that will rise up will be more complex and more difficult.
Yeah, and you know, it's a really important point, because if you look at all of the early applications of Gen AI specifically, you know, whether it's some of the research coming out of Brynjolfsson at Stanford, some of the stuff we've seen with some of our clients, because certainly you get these big productivity gains within those domains, right, because of the democratization of access and knowledge. But where you see the biggest gains are with the people with the least experience. Because in the past, we were expecting, that junior analyst, it would take her or him that much longer to do it. Now they've got access to all of the research, the data, and that's where the big productivity increases are happening. So I think Eric's study had a contact center where they saw a 23% increase in productivity for the entire population, but a 35% increase for the most junior folks, which is great early on, right? Because you've got that productivity lift. But the question then becomes, if we've now reduced the premium on experience, where do we shift that experience where the premium remains high, right? The critical thinking, the decision making, and it's also where the cost of a mistake from AI or the cost of a mistake from a human who doesn't have experience, augmented by AI, is really high. So, it's great if you're doing consulting work, right? Mistake, nobody's going to die. If you're writing a press release, nobody's going to die. But there's lots of other things where the consequences of an error are really big, and that's where I worry that this rush to lead with the tech often can lead us down to paths where there's lots of mistake. There was a big mistake, I forget the name of the company in Korea, where a team of folks, were using OpenAI, ChatGPT, and released a bunch of strategically important information, like the entire company's 5-year plan, onto ChatGPT. Well, lo and behold, their competitor had 2 analysts on the platform doing some research, and they get lots of really interesting insight. But that's where I think some of those guardrails and nuances and leaders understanding the risks and consequences becomes really important.
And if I may build on that, I think we're talking a lot about the usage and the usage case, as you were saying, and how we reinvent the business beyond just the small incremental gain that we can get. I think another area where us as leaders, we need to put our head really quickly is the cost. Because how much of this productivity gain is really costing you in terms of carbon footprint? This is something I need to report. Licenses, Copilots, all these licenses, they have a cost. The cost of potential servers or Azure or AWS space that I need to buy. And I think this is an executive decision to also weigh what are the scenarios where the costs make sense, and do these productivity gains enough to justify the cost that I'm going to put in front of it. The other element of the cost, which is also not very much talked about because the tech people are very excited to talk about the future, so they don't talk about the cost, but they will present the invoice at some point, let's be sure of that. But the other thing is also all the structuring of the data, because the machine will be as good as the data you feed into it, garbage in, garbage out. The famous sentence stays, and it's even truer, and it will even accentuate the mistakes, exactly to your point, right, if you feed the wrong data. What does it mean for me? What's the effort required for me as an executive to understand how much do I need to do to structure my data to really run an effective LLM model? This is something that is not talked about. My team, when they experiment on personalizing ad, they don't care about that question. But I need to care. So I think it goes back to having that strategy about how you use technology, to your point, to an outcome and to solve for business problems.
We had the CTO of Pure Storage here this morning, and he said the same thing about cost. Is that this never gets factored in, but using these technologies and these models is not a 2x jump in compute and storage capacity. It's 10, possibly 100, depending on what you're using it for.
Exactly.
And if you're automating something really basic, that may not make sense. And again, that's something that's a decision that's going to need to be made at the highest level. But that's a level of sophistication. That's a lot for a C-suite. I mean, that's really getting in the weeds. I mean, is that fair to ask our leaders to be able to parse this?
I mean, that's the challenge. I think that it's coming, and you have to think about all this stuff. There's obviously a training dimension. Every time we've seen kind of technological growth or introduction of new technologies, the pace of people to be able to keep up with it matters too, of whether they're using Copilot for high value stuff or whether they're like, where should I get lunch today, right? And what you're paying for, this stuff isn't cheap in that perspective. But I think that leaders getting around the corner on it is super important. And in our business, we do a lot of communications advisory. We do a lot of data within that, understanding the attitudes of employees, investors around these tough topics. And one of the things we've seen is we've been working with a lot of clients on how do you both encourage the team to use it and also not freak everybody out that jobs are at risk and have them distracted by the robots are coming for our jobs. So navigating this from an EQ perspective and a leadership perspective is going to be complicated, and you've got to both navigate the business strategy opportunity that exists, and then how it actually gets adopted within the organization, and make sure that neither of those get super out of whack as you go through the change process.
Yeah, Robin, you've written about this a lot from the early days, and you came up with this phrase, which I know exactly. You know exactly what it means. Calling for a great work reboot that is a humanistic work automation. Maybe define what humanistic work automation is, because I think we know it means people lose their jobs, but they do so in a humanistic way. So how is that sorting out, and what's, because ultimately it is the C-suite that are going to be making a lot of those decisions.
Yeah, the reason we call for that was you start to see, as we've seen with earlier technological revolutions, right? Let's just pick Gen AI for a second. The earliest experiments, Valerie, as you talked about, it's democratized access. Lots of people can go on to it, and it augments their work. It lets them do a little bit quicker, faster, better, more effectively. And that's typically how we've seen even machine learning get used. Over time, as that starts to play out, then you have the business leader who goes, well, hang on, there's 4 of them who do the same job. There's about 30% of what they're doing that now no longer needs to be done. Do I need all 4 of them? And the challenge then becomes, and we've said this a couple of times, we published a report yesterday from the Oliver Wyman Forum on Gen AI, where we talked to 25,000 people. And the findings, to a man or woman, it was like, yes, Gen AI is going to make us more productive, both the leader and all the employees we talk to. The fear was, we don't trust our leaders to necessarily do the right thing, right? Because as this plays out, will we do what we've always done, which is bank the productivity gains to the bottom line? Or will we actually take a more humanistic view? And if you think of that 25 to 30% gain, will we now say, we're going to actually share the gains with our workforce and our communities in the form of learning and well-being in the flow of work? The point you made, Matt, is a really important one around the quantum of upskilling and reskilling that's being called for is just absolutely massive. And what I think we need with a more humanistic view is viewing that workforce as not disposable. Because as we pivot from thinking of technical skills, whose half-life is shrinking dramatically, to increasingly valuing the enabling skills, learning agility, critical thinking, the ability to communicate with empathy and care and concern, then, can we then reskill and upskill talent across those traditional boundaries? Because it's so much easier to teach the new technical skills rather than to teach some of these enabling skills. And in fact, sorry, this is a shameless plug for my next book. Forgive me. Forgive me. It's called The Skills Powered Organization, and it's being published by MIT in October. But my co-author is the Chief People Officer of Standard Chartered Bank, and she's actually shown her board that by upskilling and reskilling people from the sunset jobs to the sunrise jobs, they can actually save £50,000 per person versus doing what companies have always done, which is I'll do a reduction in force here of the people I don't necessarily need, and then go out and pay above market premiums, like, and compete with all my competitors for the same type of talent that's needed, which to me starts that discussion about a more holistic talent model and, a humanistic view of automation rather than a, shall we say, fatalistic view.
Mm-hmm. Can I build on that? Because, pardon me, because that's exactly our philosophy in the IDECO group. So, because we want to put the human at the center, but we also want to be absolutely transparent that yes, there will be role displaced, and yes, there will be role eliminated. But if your obsession is not to keep people in jobs, but to keep people employable, which is exactly your point, I think then we shift the conversation to this imperative for upskilling, reskilling, doing this at scale, and really shifting from a skill view of the world rather than a job and experience, or even worse, degree view of the world. And I think this is a big portion of our plea about the transferability of the skills. We run a survey on 30,000 people, both around the world, both managers and workers, and they all believe that none of them have enough skills. Whether I am a manager, I think my people don't have the skills, and I'm not sure I have the skills either, but the workers themselves are asking for the skills. And actually, the ask for development, I've raised up in the top 5 reasons why I want to stay in that company or I want to move into that company, because they are offering me a path for development. At the same time, this transferability of the skills, I can tell you, there are over half of the managers who don't believe into it. They don't believe that we can look at the skills and recombine them to create roles that will be more fit for future. So I think there is a big plea here and a big evangelization that, at least in my industry, we are doing a lot with hiring managers, because in the industry we are pretty aligned, and I'm very pleased that Tanush in Standard Chartered, we are already aligned. But I think this is a very big shift in the way that we manage talent.
The talent stuff is super interesting. It's another place where there are historically a lot of scale challenges that just disappear. So we run on-campus recruiting in the consulting model, and you get like 1,000 applicants. You've got time to interview 100, so you kind of rely on that, like resume screen, etc. There are firms now using like chatbot interviews to go test for fit, skill, etc., where you don't have to have a resume screen that relies on university brand or credential. Your first round interview can be all 1,000 people get interviewed, but it's by AI. That has profound implications in terms of like talent fit and what you can do in terms of discovering talent. Like the secret of like lots of high-end talent recruitment models is that they take the top, and then they take the top, and then they take the tippy top, and those people, after they get through the gauntlet, are like really good. It's not actually like finding the needle in the haystack. But we can now with this. You can have a different approach that could in theory lead to better fits and better aptitudes and better capabilities. And some of the skill, there's another dimension to the skill. It's not only like the upskilling and like the generational turnover and people learning how to do this stuff. It can also be a fit question of like, well, you're really good at this and you will be experienced at that, and using AI to help augment that very, very difficult dimension of finding the right spots for people, that opens up a whole nother new possibility on this stuff too.
And can I throw something on top? Because what we are looking, and we have actually signed a partnership with Microsoft on this, is also looking at motivation, expectation, ambition. Because suddenly when you start to align skills with what really gets you up in the morning, then you get a magic combination of people who are highly motivated for a job where they might have only a portion of the skills. And so what we are creating is really this career platform where we will be able to, through interviews, and not interviews on what have you done in your last job, but what is your dream in life?
Right.
Where do you want to be? Where do you want to grow up into when you are a big guy? And I think there is here an opportunity to redefine how you look for your career path and what will be the things that you need to do as well, because you can also imagine having a skilling path that will be then deduced from what your ambition is given your current skills and where you want to be when you grow up. I'm opening air brackets, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, is because we're looking at it from the employer's perspective of finding the best talent, but just as revolutionary as individuals looking for employers and looking for environments where they can thrive, and then being brought along. I hear this theme that all of you sort of touched on, is that, like, yes, AI can remove jobs, but AI can also be the tool to give your employees superpowers. And they want them, they've asked for them, and it's been a scaling problem for a lot of industries. And you mentioned a couple of industries in particular that are hard to scale up at, for historical reasons.
Right, like not to nerd out, but
this is the place to do.
like one of the problems that we've seen over, call it, the past 30 years as technology has really ramped up is from an economics perspective, it's called Baumol's cost disease, which is where a sector becomes super productive and then the gains from that sector get poured into consumption of related sectors. So technology increases productivity and all of a sudden you buy more education, you buy more healthcare. So the sectors that have problem scaling because of human kind of one-to-one stuff of okay, how many people can you really have in classroom or whatever, costs on that go up as there's more competition and more consumption. Places where you can have, where AI can augment some of these traditional problems of okay, how many x-rays can a doctor really review, how many one-on-one tutors can a person really do. If AI helps remove those barriers to scale in these industries, you can have a transformative effect in terms of accessibility and opportunity within those industries that to date have been big problems in terms of cost implications and scaling implications. Could be fascinating.
Yeah, I 100% agree. There have been some really impressive use cases of Gen AI in healthcare, and even going back a couple of about 10 years. If you think of the machine learning that IBM had introduced with in terms of for oncology diagnosis, and then you overlay Gen AI on that, the gains are massive. And particularly, let's pick the United States, right? Care delivery is awful. We have the number of open recs for nurses and the number of doctors leaving the profession is just ridiculously high because the deal doesn't make any more sense, right? It's the economics don't work and the volume of work doesn't work. One of the big issues with that in the surveys we've seen is they are doing things that none of them went into that profession for, right? They want to spend time with patients. They want to be doing care. They don't want to be doing the highly repetitive rules-based stuff that the insurance company kind of sticks them with. And that's really where Gen AI has been really helpful because it's been, to the very point you made, it's been that magic elixir, for want of a better phrase, that both restores kind of the humanity of the work and takes a bunch of stuff that, is done by an expensive person and is now done at not zero cost, but it looks like it's zero cost, at least initially. So it's a really interesting win-win, and it kind of restores the humanity in a profession that for a long time has been sort of losing its humanity.
I see there's sort of two different threads if we look at what's driving AI enthusiasm on an executive level anyway. There's one thread, it's just the pure ability to automate tasks, as you were saying, and make things more efficient. And make your enterprise more efficient, and maybe that reduces in some reduction in headcount, but it's an efficiency play. There's another thread that I hear people talking about where they look at these tools and say, you know what, this is a growth play. We can grow faster using these tools with our staff And it's like, it almost seems like two different approaches. And I think we probably all know CEOs who are on both sides of that equation, but like, how optimistic are you that the growth path is really the way to go?
I think it goes back to your role as an executive, which is you need to decide on your capital allocation based on the best outcome. That's at the core of our job in the C-suite. Where do I put my money to get the best outcome for my client, for my growth, for my loyalty? Because what you were talking, and I want to build on that, on the healthcare, if you project that in the private business, the quality of the experience that will drive the loyalty, that will then drive a lower go-to-market cost, this also is something that a company may look into as well as a benefit. And so I think this idea of looking at the capital allocation on where you are going to get the best return is super important. And that's why to those CEOs and some of my colleagues who are thinking only about the efficiency play, I'm also saying, hey, let's be careful not to use a sledgehammer to just crack a little nut. What you're talking about is basic automation, not LLM model. So it goes back to the capital allocation. Do you really want to have complex AI just to automate this portion of the work? I think what we're talking about and the example we were giving, for example, for nurses or for doctors or for this type of profession is about being able to access a huge database and to restitute a diagnosis, a recommendation in a way that will be accepted by the person who's going to receive it. So with the right tone, the right words, potentially in the same language. So it's very different than, okay, I just need to automate, some repetitive task, which for me can be solved in a very different way and probably cheaper way.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think that it's a really important point, Valerie, that, with all the hyper on Gen AI, I think we've kind of, like with anything, over-indexed to it, versus where we see this play out really well is the combination of technologies, right? Even RPA, your basic rules-based model, machine learning, and Gen AI working in an ecosystem has been incredibly powerful because, and the point you made is a really good one, every leader's got the choice of, do I shrink my way to profitability, or do I find a way of continuously reinventing the business model so we can keep scaling and growing? And that's really where I think the reinvention of the platform, I think, becomes really essential.
Yeah, growth and efficiency are just two sides of the productivity coin, right? I think, and it'll be both. If I had to guess, it'll probably differ by sector, by industry, and then even within industries, I bet it'll differ by company or firm within the industries. But I think what we're probably looking at, if I had to guess, is research-heavy types of firms that are thinking about like drug discovery, materials discovery. There'll be probably more of a growth balance to the productivity gains. And if I had to guess, I would say that some of the traditional people-heavy, personal-heavy, like interactive-heavy, there'll be gains on the efficiency side of that. I wouldn't use efficiency necessarily as a stand-in for everybody's going to get fired, but I think that the quality of scaling those interpersonal actions is probably higher on those types of industries.
We've talked. What's the role of human intuition in all of this? Because I mean, there's sort of a myth of the great leader who brings their intuition and can set this agenda. What are the skills that we don't think are going to get automated in this process?
I do think for near term, you still have to know what the important question is. You still have to know to ask that question. Like I did a piece on the Baumel's disease bit a while ago, but if I asked AI, hey, what sectors are going to be impacted by AI, it would be like, oh, everything's going to be, you have to still have the premise, you have to still connect the dots. I think that the analysis will get easier, but the synthesis and the questions at the front end don't lose the relevance or the importance. And if anything, the bar goes up on identifying, and that is the job of a leader, is to decide what is important and what is not important or less important, and prioritize and think about those things. And so asking the right questions never goes out of style.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll pivot to human responsibility, because the big question is about who's responsible? Is it the machine who made the decision, or is it me? For us, there is no doubt. We are responsible. Just, there were all that debate with driverless car. If you have an accident, who is responsible? The guy who built the car or yourself as the no driver? Well, at the end of the day, we are responsible. So I think there is a necessary human oversight, and it will vary depending on where you apply the model. When I do an ad, and I personalize the ad because you're in Davos and I will show, the background of the mountains, I probably don't need a big human oversight. The consequence of that decision are not, as you were saying, saving lives but I think decisions which will impact the livelihood, the health, the safety, and probably you need to list a few ethical imperatives as human beings that we share. Here you always want to have human oversight. So it's not to say that you don't want AI. You absolutely want AI. But you just want to make sure that before you press the button, there's somebody who's done just a quick sanity check before you drive something that will have consequences that will be adverse to our humanity. So for me, there is so much, and I love technology. I'm a tech enthusiast. I lived 30 years in the tech industry. I am very, very optimistic and excited about the promise of AI. But I am also very anchored on the reality that at the end of the day, the people who are signing whatever happened, the liability is on me. So I think this is also something we need to discuss.
Yeah, completely agree.
I'm going to open it up to questions in just a few minutes, but before we do, you are all C-suite executives and very familiar with the technology. Are there any examples of how you're using AI, generative AI, or any other AI-related technology that's you think would be informative for the people listening?
I mean, I'll tell a quick story about kind of a specific, some specific client stuff that we're using it for and thinking about. We've used it to scrape TikTok's posting and identify trends that are happening on that. From a risk perspective, we had a client who wanted to review. They were looking at a partnership with a YouTube influencer, and they wanted to review
everything they ever posted.
Yes, correct.
To see if they did something offensive 7 years ago.
That is correct. And the exercise, a year ago would have been okay, round up the associates, everyone tuck in for the weekend. And now, you have the AI scrape it and say, please review this for sensitive material. And the AI comes back and says, hey, you ought to look at videos 134, 236, and this one.
Did you have to upload keywords to which were the words they should look for?
We gave it a prompt of
gave it a little
here's the danger zones that we want to avoid. But that's the type of stuff that we're using in real time to solve client problems. I do think that it definitely requires a push on all of this to think about using this stuff creatively, because there's the temptation that we can all get kind of lazy with this stuff and say okay, here's the thing, and you don't check it, or in this example, the team is really thinking creatively about how technology can augment solutions that in the past would have been a giant pain in the butt, right? But I think part of the onus on all of us is to lean into it and take it for the opportunity that it is, as opposed to kind of cool, I don't have to write memos anymore.
Yeah.
So I stole an idea from one of my good friends who is a repeated startupper. And it's a bit creepy, but it's crazy effective. How do you do a meeting to create a new business model with ChatGPT in the room as a participant? And when you have a doubt, you ask questions. Has this been done before? Who are the typical competitors on these things? What would be the typical tactics you would do for this? And the power that you bring into the conversation is mind-blowing. And there is a bit of that creepiness because it's almost like you have a third party in the room. So we were together with my team experimenting, and again, I stole the idea from someone else. But I felt this is so powerful because you have access not only to data in a way that you can question, but also say, okay, so you gave me that insights. What would you recommend we do about it? Can you imagine the time we're savings in evaluating an idea? I think this is very powerful, and it gives you a sense of what you could do if you really think about the power of that technology.
Yeah, the conversational aspect to it, in a lot of, and this is what Google's worried about, is that we've been entering terms into a search box for 10 years, and you could do all that work. It would take you hours, and you'd have to find the sources, get through all the ads that you are experiencing there, and this can get basically the same data set, and take it one step further with a level of synthesis that may not be perfect, but is like, certainly it's another person at the table and another view, and just accelerates things a little bit.
And can you imagine the wealth of knowledge that person is bringing to the table?
Yeah.
Exactly. So I've got two examples for you, and actually a really funny anecdote to the creepy thing you just said. So at 6 o'clock this morning, I had a call with a team of mine in Singapore. And yesterday afternoon, we published that report I mentioned. And so they were interviewing me for a project that they were doing around the skills of the next generation HR leader. And I said, well, we published this report, yesterday. And they're like, oh, yeah, we uploaded it into our own large language model. And it not only spat out the highlights, but it actually also called out all of the skills for the next generation leader that are called for. And this was done in literally minutes. And it was mind-blowing. And we built our own large language model within Marsh McLennan. And it has absolutely transformed all of the knowledge work, right? Your typical consulting work, to the point you made, Matt, the analysis, the synthesis, and then, ensuring that you've got an experienced eye to make sure that, hey, that sounds like nonsense to me, right? Before the client sees it. But the speed with which it is allowing us to do some of this has been truly transformative. The other application that I'm really intrigued by, we had talked about digital twins, right? And in 2018, when I wrote my book with the HBR called Reinventing Jobs, we had a number of examples of what GE had done with embedding sensors so that they built a digital twin for every jet engine and turbine that they built. And if you think about what the productivity impact there, right, in terms of you get to simulate stress failures, well in advance of something happening like that. You get to simulate when preventive maintenance is required and time it just right. Now, what you're seeing, thanks to NVIDIA and others, is the creation of entire ecosystems. So Siemens, the CEO of Siemens was talking at CES about they actually build a digital twin for before they even build any factories, right? They can actually simulate every single part of it. I've got a client where, from a workforce perspective, they can simulate repeated motion injuries, for people in different types of jobs and design the safeguards. And they do that for every single factory, both planned and for existing ones, to keep improving their productivity and reducing their OSHA claims. So that's another application that I think has got immense legs. The creepy part is I was with a client in Zurich a couple of months ago, and I had a colleague on Zoom, and he was trying to demonstrate the power of generative AI. So he takes a picture of the room and uploads it to OpenAI, and it scans the room and it calls out. It notices a purse that one of the ladies in the room had, and it says, oh, that's a really interesting bag. Did you know that bag costs $15,000? Wow. And everyone looks at the woman in question and goes, how much are you paid now? Yeah. So it was, be careful, right?
Yeah, be careful what you upload, be careful what you post. These are rules to live by. I've got like 35 more questions, but we've also got some really smart people in the room. I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions of the panel. Just raise your hand if you have one.
In the meantime, can I build on that example of the injury?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is also, I also have an example that shows that sometimes you don't need the LLM to do what's right. Because, for example, in the Adecco group, what we're doing, we've put in place a way to train forklift drivers in a virtual machine. And by doing this, we've reduced injuries by a factor of 100 or 10, because the reality is that they can experience all the bad things that can happen in a safe environment. So we can simulate, okay, what do you do in case of collision? No, you don't jump outside of the forklift.
Right.
So all these kind of things. And I think this is where we need to understand, okay, are you good enough with a virtual model to teach people to reduce injuries? Or do you really need to have an LLM model to really understand where you would have injuries, etc.? Because the reality is, and it's back to the decision to the executive. Where are you going to allocate your AI? Do I allocate AI here, or do I have a good enough solution that will get me 90% there, where I don't necessarily need to have a full LLM model? So it doesn't apply to all the rest that you've described, but just on this one.
But that's, I think, goes back to the earlier point, right? What are the technologies that are fit for purpose? Mm-hmm. Because machine learning could probably do a lot of some of those things, versus, you do need, more power in certain other situations. And the point you made, though, is a really important one, and it brought back a quote, Valerie, that back in 1998, we built this really simple simulation for a very large healthcare company, and something the CFO said to me really stuck, because it speaks to the power of kind of these digital twins in the industrial metaverse, is I get to crash the business in this simulation, right? Mm-hmm. That's not a luxury I or any of my team have in the real world. And I think that's the mindset, right, that we're really looking for here.
There's a dimension of using it to its max will require a lot of creativity and a lot of reimagining of things that we're used to, that just it's just the way you do it, right? So as an example, in polling or survey work, right, you poll your employees or whatever stakeholder group that you're concerned about. When people construct surveys, you go through and it's like A, B, C, blah, blah, blah. That construction is done that way only because if you survey 1,000 people, no person can go through all the stuff. You have to have this structure to be able to synthesize the data. Today, you could say, what do you think about X? And 1,000 people can respond in whatever they think, and you functionally have a statistically significant focus group, where it is no longer constrained by what you think they're going to answer or the things that you want to test for or any of that. So that norm that has existed for 50, 60 years in polling and survey work, internally, externally, we've got the year of elections coming up. There's no reason that process should be done the way it's been done for decades. But it's going to take a reimagining and generational change and a lot of new thinking on everyday parts of our job to really suss out where the value is going to sit in these changes.
So if I grab some takeaways, ultimately the executives still have to know what questions to ask. Mm-hmm. That's not going to change. It's always been that way. They have to take the business priorities first, allocate their resources from an ethical place as well as an efficiency place. Those questions that they ask, they'll make get responses much faster than they used to, because they don't have to do internet searches. They don't need an entire department to do a report. They can get responses faster. But ultimately, the one thing that's true is that those questions are going to be different than the questions we asked a year ago and 5 years ago, which it just is what it is. As you pointed out, it's going to be really hard in our pre-calls. Does that sound about fair? Do you want to add to that?
There is a great quote that I absolutely love, and it's from 1970, and it's from Alvin Toffler, the futurist, and he said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write, it'll be those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn, which I think is just the perfect metaphor for where we are.
I love it.
That's a better quote than what I had to end up the conference.
Sorry.
Also, we're going to have plenty of time to talk. We're going to get some wine and drinks. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.